Hi there, everyone. I have a story for you today that is not my story to tell. I'm going to read it, but it's Phyllis's story to tell. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking about how we need to share ourselves. We need to not be afraid to share our stories with other people. But the other side of that, of course, is to be sure that we listen and hear the stories that others have to share with us. And this Thursday, September 30th, is Orange Shirt Day, or as we call it now, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a day to honor and hear the stories of Indigenous people in Canada. And the story that started the idea of the orange shirt is a story told by Phyllis Webstad of how she had a brand new shirt that was taken away from her when she went to residential school. And it's a story that reminds us of how so much was lost for so many Indigenous children through that experience. And so it's the story I want to share with you today. I also want to say, though, that it's important that we hear all the stories. Don't ever think that just because you've heard a few stories, you've heard everything that there is to hear, because everyone has a story. And Phyllis would be the first person to tell you that, because her story is not like anyone else's story. Her experience of residential school is not like everyone else's. And she'd be the first to say, well, she does say, she was one of the lucky ones. Here's Phyllis's story. The Orange Shirt Story by Phyllis Webstad, illustrated by Brock Nickel. When Phyllis was a little girl, she lived with her granny on the Dog Creek Reserve, part of the Canoe Creek First Nation. Their home had no electricity and no indoor toilet. In the summer, when the sun was hot, Phyllis would cool herself off in the bathtub full of water that Granny kept in her garden. Phyllis and Granny lived off the food they grew in Granny's garden and berries from the land. Granny and Phyllis would go to the Fraser River and catch fish. They would eat some fish for dinner and dry the rest on the drying rack to save for winter. They didn't have much, but they got by with what they had. Growing up, Phyllis felt lonely. There weren't many children on the reserve to play with. Each September, all the older children, like her cousin, would leave the reserve to go to school. Phyllis looked forward to the day that she could go too. Phyllis didn't get many hugs when she was little, but she did have Granny, and Granny's house was a safe place for everyone on the reserve. There were lots of people who came to Granny for help and advice. Phyllis's favorite place to be was Granny's kitchen. When Phyllis turned 6 in July, Granny made her a cake to celebrate her birthday. Granny told Phyllis now that she was 6, she was old enough to go to school. When September came, she would go to the residential school, St. Joseph's Mission, for the first time. Phyllis was excited about going to school so she could play with her cousin and the other children. She wanted to find out what happened there and hoped she would make some friends. Before her first day at school, Granny took Phyllis into town to buy her a new shirt. They didn't have a car or a truck, so when they went to town, they would take a blue bus that they called the Stage. Going to town was exciting. They took the stage down a noisy and bumpy dirt road. Soon the bumps stopped and the noise hushed. Phyllis looked out the window and saw a paved road whizzing by underneath them. The town was so loud and busy, with people and vehicles everywhere. There were shops to visit and restaurants to eat in. One shop had a red and white pole outside of it. Phyllis watched it twirl round and round, and she wondered where the stripes were going. Granny took Phyllis to a restaurant, and they sat at a booth with a mini jukebox. When Phyllis dropped a coin into the slot, the box would play a song for her. Phyllis ordered breakfast with 2 eggs. When they came, they were sunny side up. It was like they were looking up at her from the plate. Phyllis didn't know how to eat them. Granny's eggs were always scrambled. After breakfast, Granny took Phyllis to a shop that was filled with clothes and toys. Phyllis picked out a shiny orange shirt that laced down the front. It was bright and exciting. She felt as excited about the shirt as she did about going to school. Granny bought the shirt, and they got back on the stage and went home. Phyllis held the bag with her orange shirt in it all the way. She promised herself that she wouldn't wear it until the big day when she went to school. Phyllis waited and waited, and finally the day arrived. Phyllis, wearing her shiny orange shirt for the first time, said goodbye to Granny. Granny patted her on the head and said, "What loves it?" Phyllis got on the stage with all the other children and waved at Granny from the window. It was a 2-hour journey to get to the residential school, much further than Phyllis had ever traveled before. She stared out of the window, waiting to see the place where they were going. When they arrived, Phyllis started to feel very scared. The residential school was so much taller than anything she had seen before. The building seemed cold and unfriendly as the nuns who came out of the school to meet them. Phyllis asked her cousin how long they had to stay there. Her cousin said that it would be 300 sleeps before they could go home. 300 sleeps? That sounded like forever. The nuns took all the children inside and walked them down a long hallway in single file. In a room, the children were undressed and made to take a shower. Phyllis had never seen water coming out of the walls before. Phyllis didn't want to take off her shiny orange shirt, but the nuns made her. After she had showered, they gave her different clothes to wear. She didn't like them. The nuns put Phyllis in a chair and cut her hair short. She asked for her orange shirt back, but they told her that she wouldn't be allowed to wear it anymore. Phyllis cried, "Give it back. It's not yours, it's mine. My granny bought it for me." But no one would listen. The residential school wasn't where Phyllis learned. It was a place where the children slept and ate. Phyllis soon realized that the nuns didn't care if she was tired, sick, hungry, or sad. She had to rely on herself. It felt as though she didn't matter. At dinner time, Phyllis and the other children would eat tasteless and almost colorless food. There were pale green moon-shaped beans that tasted awful, and there was smelly fish that definitely wasn't like the salmon that she and Granny used to eat together. At night, Phyllis wondered why Granny was not coming to get her. She would cry herself to sleep. In her dreams, she would play in Granny's garden and go salmon fishing in the river. Each day, the children went into town to attend public school. Before boarding the bus, they picked up a small carton of orange juice and brown paper bags with their lunches inside. Some days, 1 or 2 children got a chocolate bar in their lunch. Everyone would look to see if they had one too, but their lunch bags just had sandwiches. It felt like the grown-ups were playing a cruel joke on them. Phyllis took the bus to public school with her cousin. Every day, the bus driver dropped her cousin off at a different school. Phyllis wished she could go with her. She didn't understand why they couldn't be together. At school, Phyllis learned to read and write with all the other boys and girls, but she was still lonely. All the children from the residential school were lonely because they'd been taken away from their homes and their families. Her teacher was a curly-haired redhead. She was as nice as she smelled. She would smile at Phyllis and help her with her lessons. Phyllis wished she could go home with her teacher at the end of the day. She made being at school bearable. Phyllis liked her teacher, but she was no substitute for Granny. She wondered what Granny was doing while Phyllis went to school every day. Phyllis missed her home in the garden. She started counting the days until she could go back again. Each day the number got smaller and smaller. She waited, and she waited. The other children at school could order books from a book club, but none of the residential school children were allowed to get any. Phyllis didn't understand why they were treated differently. She wanted a book too. Why wasn't she allowed one? In the playground, she was just like all the other boys and girls. At lunchtime, everyone played together. Phyllis learned to swing on the swings and would wrap her swing around the pole and watch it unwind. The best time of day was when the bus came to pick them up after school. Phyllis always saved a seat for her cousin. When it came time to her stop, her cousin would run on the bus and plop down next to Phyllis. Sometimes she would bring onions that she picked on the school grounds. Her cousin would say, "Want some?" And Phyllis would laugh at her onion breath. But Phyllis was always so hungry. She would grab an onion and eat it like an apple. Her breath smelled just as bad as her cousin's. On the bus, they learned to sing songs together, and they sang, "We are the missions, mighty, mighty missions. Everywhere we go, oh, people want to know, oh, who we are, so we tell them, we are the missions." The seasons changed from fall to winter, then to spring, and finally it was summer again. Phyllis was excited about going home. She never wanted to go back to the residential school or see the cold-hearted nuns ever again. After 300 sleeps, the stage came and took Phyllis back home to the reserve. She was so happy to be back to a place where she mattered, a place where people cared about her. That summer, she stayed at home with her Granny. She stayed in her familiar house and worked with Granny in the garden. She went fishing for salmon in the Fraser River, and she ate them for dinner. She had everything she needed, and she never went back to the residential school again. Not every child was as lucky as Phyllis.